Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be going through lessons learned, looking back through the National Register and Survey with architectural historian, and many of you know, Barb Power is here. We want to thank both the Ohio Department of Development and the Ohio Arts Council for funding webinars like these. Before we introduce Barb and get things going here, I just have a couple housekeeping items for everyone. First off, if the webinar seems strange, slides don't seem to be moving, we're all weird and garbled on your end, just close down the webinar, click the link that was sent to you, and that'll get things restarted for you as well. We will be taking questions at the end of today's webinar, but please type them into the question box as you have them, and we'll get those answered once Barb finishes her presentation. And finally, this webinar is going to be recorded. You'll be receiving an email tomorrow with that link and any other pertinent information Barb has to share with you. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Frank to introduce Barb.
Thanks, Devin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Frank Quinn, the Director of Preservation for Heritage Ohio. And gee, I had the distinct pleasure, I would say, of being able to work closely with Barb for about 7 years when I was on OSPAB, the Ohio Historic Sites Preservation
Preservation
Advisory
Advisory
Board.
Board.
It's a mouthful. And we would review nominations to the National Register and also review grant applications for the Certified Local Government annual grant awards that were made. And it was a great chance for me to see Barb in action and to just have a chance to um, be able to witness the amazing work that was being done through the department that she headed up. They worked on the Ohio Archaeological Inventory, the Ohio Historic Inventory, the OAI, the OHI forms that a lot of consultants are very familiar with filling out, and of course, the National Register of Historic Places. So once Barb retired, I gave her a little bit of time, a few months, and then I contacted her and I said, I think there's a lot of people who would like to hear a career retrospective or sh Barb sharing some of the high points of her career with the SHPO. So Barb graciously agreed. And so that is what we are doing today. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Barb. And like everyone watching, I am just going to sit and enjoy taking this all in.
Well, thank you, Frank and Devin. That's very kind of you. And thank you for inviting me to do this webinar. We'll see how it all goes. I don't think it's a big surprise to most people probably joining us. I loved my job, and I'd say I had one of the greatest jobs of all time. And so I've kind of listed a few things here that I've thought about that made it so. And if you went strictly by the numbers, what does an estimated 2,137 National Register listings, approximately 40,000 Ohio Archaeological Inventory forms, a little over 21,000 Ohio Historic Inventory forms added to their respective inventories during my 42 years at the State Historic Preservation Office convey about historic preservation in Ohio? Well, a lot of numbers, and numbers can be boring. So in trying to figure out how to create this webinar and what I thought would be of interest and value to my audience, in addition to the points you see up here on the screen, I kept coming back to a few other big ideas. First of all, the incredible richness and diversity of Ohio's history and the built environment that reflects it, the importance of discovering it and raising awareness about it, the importance of partnerships, the obvious ones within the historic preservation community and the less obvious ones that often are so essential to success in preserving historic properties. Taking calculated and informed risks, working to find a way forward, never taking yourself too seriously. Somebody always knows something you do not, or has a different perspective on the topic or the matter at hand. Be open to embracing your differences and finding solutions. So for the webinar, I've picked some examples I think help illustrate some of these big ideas and ultimately reinforce the power of place. That's what we all do in our historic preservation worlds, and why it's worthy of preservation. So I love this quote. So I quote Pulitzer Prize winning author Louis Bromfield. Where exactly is Ohio? It is the farthest west of the east and the farthest east of the west, the farthest north of the south and the farthest south of the north. And it is probably the richest area of its size in the world. So many of you can just spend the rest of this webinar kind of contemplating that. But still today, as throughout its history, Ohio's variety and balance between urban and rural, industry and agriculture, northern and southern, eastern and western, make it a state rich in architectural quality and character and worthy of preservation. So I spent my entire career in the State Historic Preservation Office, Ohio's official historic preservation agency. The office is part of the Ohio History Connection, and the State Historic Preservation Office administers programs and requirements established by the National Historic Preservation Act. We work with people throughout the state to identify, evaluate, and protect historic properties. The Ohio State Office, from its beginnings and into the early 1980s, most survey and National Register products were produced through the efforts of 21 regional offices. These offices were co-sponsored by the SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, and universities, local historic preservation or historical societies, or local governments. Offices were staffed with historians, architectural historians, or archaeologists. Their primary charge was to survey and nominate qualifying properties to the National Register. Ohio's first state historic preservation officer and director for the Ohio Historical Society, Daniel Porter, felt strongly that historic preservation could not happen effectively, especially the review of federally funded projects, without knowing what was significant within the state. With major federal funding cuts in the early 1980s, does that sound familiar? These regional offices were reduced to 5 and then completely eliminated. The Survey and National Register programs then operated out of the main State Historic Preservation Office in Columbus, with a staff that fluctuated between 2 and 4, very similar to today. I started in 1982, was handed a big box filled with National Register nominations and said, start reviewing these. Throughout my career, I was primarily involved with our survey and National Register programs. The Ohio Archaeological Inventory records information and location of archaeological sites in Ohio. Related survey reports and maps are an essential component of this inventory. The Ohio Historic Inventory is an ongoing statewide survey of buildings, sites, structures, and objects of historical and architectural significance. Let's talk about a couple examples of survey. With the threat of a highway crossing through the rich farming landscape of rural Elizabeth Township in Miami County, the local residents of the township decided to take steps to preserve the rural character of Elizabeth Township. The group raised funding to provide for a survey of both the archaeological sites and the historic properties in Elizabeth Township, a necessary first step in understanding what is significant and what the nature of the historic resources are. The survey documented 296 properties, many of them farmsteads with numerous outbuildings, and 117 historic archaeological sites. The property owners then took the next step. They weren't just satisfied with documenting through survey, and they nominated the entire township to the National Register of Historic Places. The Elizabeth Township Rural Historic District is a model for the preservation of other rural communities in Ohio. The National Register documentation provided valuable information for informed decision-making by local officials. The local residents and officials moved from heated public meetings to working together to take steps to continue to recognize and preserve the distinct rural character of this portion of Miami County. They worked together on the signage and also worked on some more tangible aspects like determining transfer of development rights from their township area to a more developed areas of the county. During the early 2000s, we realized we had very little survey documentation for what at that time was referred to as the recent past, the years following the Great Depression into the post-World War II era. We wanted to find out about Ohio's recent past, roughly 1940 to 1970. We chose this time period for the Ohio Modern Initiative because in Ohio, it is a historic time period defined by the tremendous industrial buildup to World War II, in which Ohio's industries played such an important role, and by 1970, the end of Governor Rhodes' second term and the beginnings of change for Ohio. We wanted to know what were the significant themes associated with Ohio history and what did Ohio look like during this period. We launched our Ohio Modern Preserving Our Recent Past initiative, which is described up here on the screen, which included history architecture surveys, statewide historic context document, along with workshops, presentations, and other educational terms. And we learned a lot. We learned about new materials like precast concrete or curtain wall construction. We learned about different building types, modern expressions of religious buildings, including synagogues and churches, as well as new building types like medical offices. Doctors no longer operated out of their houses. We learned and documented much about suburban residential properties like the Ohioan, which was a Huber Homes model. Huber Heights was the home of this company. And they released new models every year, kind of like cars that you could buy plans for and build. New architectural details like this projecting canopy and signage, roadside signage. The survey reports, OHIs, and statewide historic context are all available on the Ohio State Historic Preservation Office website. And the National Register, a cornerstone of the historic preservation program, serving as the official list of properties worthy of preservation for their significance in American history, archaeology, architecture, engineering, and culture. It was created by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended. So here's our looking back through my career, the National Register has changed over time to meet the demands of historic preservation and documentation. The National Register tells the stories of Ohio's history and documents the architectural history of the state's buildings, sites, structures, objects, and districts. Additionally, the National Register illustrates the development and growth of the historic preservation movement in the United States. Ohio's earliest National Register nominations included well-known state memorials and Ohio historic sites. These were major monuments of Ohio history, including Newark earthworks. The mounds and earthworks of the prehistoric cultures of the Fort Ancient, Adena, and Hopewell Long before Europeans arrived, these earliest inhabitants of present-day Ohio left their mark on the landscape. The monumental earthen architecture provides valuable insight into ceremonies and belief systems of these ancient American Indian cultures. Ohio settlers brought their building traditions with them. In South Central Ohio, Adena, the home of Thomas Worthington, early Ohio statesman, reflects early Ohio statehood and settlement patterns, showing the Virginia influence of its owner in its classical details and detached or semi-detached dependencies. Settlers in Northeast Ohio were largely from New England and upstate New York. New England town plans were transplanted into village greens, often with centrally located public buildings such as Talmadge Church. Also showing the influence of local carpenter builders' use of pattern books and builders' guides. The National Register nominations listed in the 1970s also include some of the state's most outstanding examples of historic architecture. The nationally significant Greek Revival style Ohio State House. And see that drum up there at the very top? That's where that first picture, that's where we actually were standing. The spectacular Art Deco Cincinnati Union Terminal and the outstanding Gothic Revival Oak Hill Cottage. These properties that were being nominated at this time, they were well known, and their history and their significance were known. So early nominations, the irony is that early nominations for some of, arguably some of the most significant properties in the state have actually very little documentation because people knew what they were. And the National Register sort of treated these properties as isolated properties with a history and that distinctive significance. So as the National Register program expanded and broadened in its impact in achieving historic preservations in cities and towns or urban and rural settings, so too did the type of properties nominated to the National Register. National Register nominations started listing not only the homes of major industrialists, but the factories where the products were produced and the homes of the workers. Richmond Brothers Factory, 700 fussy tailors, reflecting an important part of Cleveland's early 20th century garment industry, and the innovative concrete constructed Youngstown sheet and tube housing, a reminder of Youngstown's steel industry. Nominations included the entire farmstead, not just the farmhouse or individual barn, broadening the recognition of Ohio's rich agricultural history. The Taney Musser Farm, 185 years of regional agricultural development in Wayne County through the 6 generations of the Taney and Musser families, reflected the historic farming practices of local agricultural traditions embodied in 19th and 20th century family farms. The studies of vernacular architecture and landscape architecture actually developed in the 70s and 80s along with the historic preservation movement. Studies in these fields identified the 19th century house types such as the I-house property type of the Mace House in Ross County, showing the more common type of houses reflecting early settlement and additional upland South influence in South Central Ohio. Spring Grove Cemetery is an important example of landscape design reflecting 19th century rural cemetery movement. And the unassuming ranch house, but home to suburban humorist housewife turned author Irma Bombeck. Likewise, with these nominations, we started seeing more detailed National Register nomination documentation. This time, the Park Service introduced the idea of developing a historic context and providing a comparative analysis to go with these properties. They were no longer so much seen as these isolated properties, but that they were part of a broader pattern that should be documented and summarized in the nomination. Time marches on. 50 years now has us looking back to the mid-1970s as a historic period reflecting the recent past. After World War II, Ohio continued to grow and remained a national leader in manufacturing and industry. This continued economic strength found modern architectural expression, ranging from the early international style row house, a distinctive stark white geometric form in the landscape, and one of the first modernist hotels in the country, the Terrace Plaza, designed by woman modernist Nathalie DuBois of the firm Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, to the dramatic forms dominating their sites, like the geodesic dome of the ASM headquarters and the bold, innovative cantilevered block of our own headquarters, the Ohio History Center. Plus the magnificent post-war Park Synagogue by Mendelssohn, one of only a few buildings he actually designed in the United States. Now the National Register is recognizing significant examples of urban renewal projects of the 1960s and early 70s, such as the fiberglass tower in downtown Toledo, the very kind of federally funded projects that prompted the passing of the National Historic Preservation Act and the creation of the National Register. Talk about coming full circle. But also, we found buildings and places of our past have ways of disappearing, especially when their histories are not as self-evident as a grandiose architectural statement or a long-remembered association with a town founder or local leader. We realized that many historic properties associated with African American civil rights history that once defined these places, they were fast disappearing, demolished, replaced, or now just vacant lots. So to borrow a phrase calling for federal civil rights legislation in the 1960s, we felt the fierce urgency of now to proactively nominate properties associated with African American history to the National Register. We received National Park Service grants funding the multiple property theme study, African American Civil Rights Movement in Ohio, 1900 to 1970, and nominated the Eugene McKinley Memorial Swimming Pool in Portsmouth, more about that later, a site associated with local issues of segregation and civil rights, and the Mance Hotel and Annex in Cincinnati, a historic Black-owned hotel and Green Book listing. Additional properties came later, such as the Franklin Park Medical Center and the Myrtle Highview Historic District that utilized this theme study. Additional National Park Service grants supported the work of former State Office staff member Diamond Crowder in nominating King Records Studio in Cincinnati to the National Register. Created in 1943, King Records Studio was one of the first racially integrated record labels that hired countless African Americans to work at the recording studio and was home of James Brown, or first home of James Brown. Diamond mended the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, an Ohio History Connection historic site in Cincinnati, to expand its African American significance in the 20th century. The Stowe House was home to the abolitionist and best-selling author of Uncle Tom's Cabin that depicts the reality of slavery in America. In the mid-20th century, the Stowe House was the Edgemont Inn, a boarding house and tavern for African Americans. The Edgemont Inn was a Green Book site. With the last received National Park Service grant, Diamond nominated the West Federal YMCA, a Rosenwald-funded Y for young Black men and boys in Youngstown. Another National Park Service grant to our office worked with Cleveland Restoration Society to nominate historic Black churches in Cleveland. I am proud of the 4 National Park Service grants we received to nominate underrepresented properties in the National Register. Now the challenge is out there to advocate for the return of grants such as these to continue this type of work. Funding to nominate properties that tell the full story of Americans facing and overcoming obstacles and challenges. So I couldn't do a National Register talk without having this slide because it's so important. It's just, what are the basic elements to how a property qualifies for the National Register? Age. Typically properties are 50 years or older, although we're going to see a couple exceptions to that here shortly. Significance. National Register nomination has to establish and tell why the property is important in history, architecture, archaeology, culture. And it does that through addressing the National Register criteria for evaluation, which addresses a property's significance in history, association with important people, architectural design or stylistic significance, information potential. And it can establish that at national, state, local levels of significance. In Ohio, as with the rest of the country, the majority of nominations are recognized for that local level of significance. And lastly, but certainly not most least, is historic integrity. The whole programs we're talking about are all based in place-based history. So the National Register very much has to have properties have to retain historic characteristics to convey that its significance. You have to understand why the property is significant and then determine what the property's physical features are that help to reflect that significance. We can never lose sight of these basic requirements. There are many, many motivations for why people seek to nominate properties to the National Register. And no matter what the motivation is, the nomination will not be successful unless it addresses these basic requirements. Likewise, we never can stop reminding and informing and educating about what the National Register does do and what it doesn't do. Of course, the National Register listing really ultimately does not affect a property owner's rights as a property owner. It's an important planning and educational tool. It provides a sense of pride and recognition as properties being recognized as worthy of preservation, but for the most part leaves that decision-making in the hands of the people closest to the property owner, the local officials. It does provide benefits, the historic rehabilitation tax credits, providing economic incentives for income-producing properties, and the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. That's a routine part, or should be a routine part, of the planning process for all federally assisted projects. Doesn't necessarily guarantee the property won't be affected or even demolished, but it does ensure that there's an opportunity to consider effects before the project occurs. Again, I've found that the most misunderstandings about whether to preserve a property or not usually fall into often a misunderstanding about what the National Register does and doesn't do. So we can never stop reinforcing and raising awareness to educate the importance of this. And as we go through today, I'll be talking about some examples of the power of the National Register to educate, raise awareness, document Ohio's history and culture, serve as a teaching tool, and spur economic development and revitalization. So here we go. We're going to look at some buildings, sites, structures, and objects that are listed in the National Register, and I think fall under that top bullet of why I love my job so much, and that is you never stop learning. You learn something new every time, every day. The Castalia Trout Club is a private trout club, actually founded in the 1870s, and Trout Preserve, which illustrated the role of sportsmen and sportsmen's clubs in the early conservation movement in Ohio and the country. The Castalia Trout Club earned a national reputation for the propagation of trout, and during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, its hatcheries supplied their own streams, as well as provided fish for the newly developed State Conservation Division and other trout clubs in the United States. The club land includes Blue Hole, a natural tourist attraction in the Lake Erie region, popular during the early to mid 20th century. So the Castalia Trout Club was hailed by expert fish culturists as one of the most attractive and practical features of the best stream fishing in the world. And this was quoted in the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News of 1903. I just found it fascinating as I helped this prepare and see this National Register to success that these sportsmen in the late 19th, early 20th centuries were so instrumental in the development of the conservation movement, and Ohio boasted some leading figures in that. The North Bass School, which I just now realized both these examples involve fish names, that wasn't intentional, shows the role of one-room schoolhouses and the education on the Lake Erie Islands. The building, built in 1952, architecturally significant as a mid-century, minimal traditional, purpose-built one-room school that also included a residence for the teacher. It actually reflected an educational building type known as a teacherage. It served the island from 1952 to 2005. And the North Bass Local School District was the last school district to operate a one-room school in Ohio, and this was the newest one-room school. This National Register nomination was initiated by the former school superintendent. The May 4th, 1970 Kent State shooting site. The nomination documents the tragic events of May 1st through 4, 1970 at Kent State, and placed it within the larger historic context of the national student protest movement at the time, with roots in the peace movement and the civil rights movement of the early 60s, which coalesced for college students in the growing anti-war movement of the mid-60s. This property is also a National Historic Landmark. It was nationally significant given its broad effects in causing the largest student strike in the United States history, increasing recruitment for the movement against the Vietnam War, and affecting a public opinion about that war, creating a legal precedent established by the trials subsequent to the shootings, and for the symbolic status the event has attained as a result of a government confronting protesting citizens with unreasonable deadly force. Franco Ruffini was a former head of the State Historic Preservation Office and had been actually a student at Kent State during this time period, relayed this story to me. And this story tells far better than anything else I can think of the power of the National Register. It's no better evidence than by a mother of one of the slain students, explaining that she felt she no longer needed to attend the yearly Kent State memorials each May 4th, as she had found closure in the fact that the federal government had acknowledged the significance of the event by listing the site in the National Register of Historic Places. It always gets me. Structures. We have two public pools, two very different stories. The Columbus Grove Municipal Pool dates to the 1930s, and it was a product of the federally funded Works Project Administration. It was built out of locally quarried limestone. It was designed to resemble a large sand castle featuring turrets, bridges, moats, etc. I think it was fascinating because we often think of these WPA and other Depression-era federally funded projects as being more about infrastructure, roads and bridges and other such features. So we had a very kind of distinctive example of that through the Columbus Grove Pool. It's still open. You can go up to Ottawa County or Putnam County and swim. Might be closed now. It's after Labor Day. The Eugene McKinley Memorial Pool in Portsmouth. I referenced this back with our multiple property theme study for African American civil rights in Ohio. It was constructed by the city of Portsmouth as a public pool open to all, meaning African Americans who could not swim in the other public pool in the city, Dreamland. The building of the pool was prompted by the drowning of Eugene McKinley in the Scioto River, where often local African Americans had to swim because there was no other pool available. In addition to the National Register, a book has been written about the local civil rights and segregation stories associated with Portsmouth community pools. So these are places that really have powerful meaning and powerful histories. This was one of the last nominations I signed before I retired last year. This is the Contract Airmail Route 34 Columbus, Philadelphia Route Marker 2. It's also probably the longest title. Is significant as the last known remaining airmail marker system in the state of Ohio, containing all of its historic resources: the generator shed, directional marker, the big arrow, and the beacon tower. Airmail routes utilizing these marker systems emerged in the early 20th century to assist in guiding airmail pilots at night across the country. They would fly so low that they could actually look out and see these arrows. Located on Contract Airmail Route 34, the nominated marker system was constructed in 1930 for the newly implemented route for airmail from Columbus, Ohio to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and operated through the decade to 1940. This NR story adds to the rich history of aviation in Ohio that Ohio can boast. From the Wright brothers, Jerry Mock, the first woman to successfully fly around the world, early airports in Columbus and Akron, the Goodyear Air Dock, and dirigible. The nomination was prepared by State Office staff member Abby Marshall for the local group preserving this fascinating piece of history. The State Office's National Register program is very publicly driven. It responds to public interest and those seeking National Register designation. Staff reviews every National Register submitted, provides guidance and editing, and sometimes can provide additional research and more writing on a case-by-case basis, such as this. Talk about historic districts. These are significant concentrations of properties that are linked together by a shared history or architectural aesthetic or physical development. And I focus here on particularly small town Ohio. Ohio's historic growth and industrial prominence created a number of large industrial cities such as Toledo, Akron, Dayton, Youngstown, Cincinnati, and Cleveland. While many states have only a few major industrial centers, Ohio also boasts a long list of smaller cities as well. Ohio is defined by this distinctive spread of its population between larger urban centers and mediums to small towns. These medium to small towns developed as county seats, distribution centers for a regional agricultural economy, or places with a locally founded industry. As a result, these towns boast a rich collection of buildings and places that reflect their late 19th and mid-20th century growth and prosperity. Commercial centers around a courthouse square, impressive public, religious, and cultural spaces such as libraries, churches, and schools, residential neighborhoods reflecting popular period residential architecture. Many of these towns are facing challenges with the loss of local industries, jobs, and population. However, preservation tools such as the Certified Local Government designation, National Register listing, state and federal historic tax credits, historic preservation-related grant funding opportunities, and Heritage Ohio's Main Street programs can provide helpful benefits and opportunities to combine economic development and reinvestment, building off of the architectural character and history of the community. Many of these distinct communities, as you can see here, have National Register listed historic districts highlighting their local history and architectural heritage. Well, I often like to have said that the Ohio program, National Register program, we colored within the lines, meaning we followed the rules and tried to help people guide them through them. but we often were not afraid to use some pretty wild colors. The city of Dayton, their city planning department was very excited about the results for the Ohio Modern Survey that included Dayton. So they decided to pursue a National Register historic district that encompassed the entire Dayton downtown. And the key to their success was to highlight in the nomination the various city plans that had shaped the development and built environment of the downtown from the early 20th century to mid-century. The period of significance, which began in mid-19th century, 1865, and went to 1980, which you'll note is not less than 50 years, covers distinct phases of the evolution of Dayton's downtown. It's mid to late 19th century industrial and commercial development, early 20th century progressivism in civic government and the advent of city planning, economic downturn during the Great Depression and World War II, post-war development and the expansion of downtown, and the government-guided development and urban renewal during the mid-20th century in the face of economic headwinds from suburban growth and competition to downtown commerce. As I said, the period of significance for the nomination district began in 1865 with the earliest buildings associated with commerce, and then the last building related to urban renewal and the planning process that commenced during the 1960s and extended and continued with the final building built in Gem City Plaza building built in 1980, which marked the end of the period of significance. The nomination was prepared in 2018, so the 1980 date was pretty significant. This nomination received praise from the National Park Services and our reviewer for Ohio because of how it did knit together all those planning aspects and showed this progression of development history in downtown. The nomination was prepared to promote economic revitalization in the downtown, especially utilizing the historic tax credits. The Toledo Central Business District was another successful example of a National Register nomination encompassing an entire downtown of a major Ohio city. In the nomination, the urban renewal area and the more recent history of downtown Toledo development, the creation of Portside, now seen as historic, and it was one of the early urban festival marketplaces designed by the Roush Corporation. The statement of significance ended with the discussion of early preservation efforts that occurred in downtown Toledo and the early use of Section 106 compliance for the federally funded projects that were percolating. Again, the impact of this nomination has spurred additional rehabilitation of historic buildings and use of historic tax credits. And I believe, and if I'm wrong, somebody can correct me in the chat, I believe this nomination was prepared with funds generated through the pipeline grant funding that's offered through the Ohio Department of Development. Okay, how am I doing here? The Teakwood Heights neighborhood was developed by and for African Americans at a time when discrimination in housing, financing, and renting were illegal. Two couples, the Turners and the Carters, developed the neighborhood and sold individual lots to other African Americans who built their mid-century suburban neighborhood. It was significant for both its association with Columbus African American history and for its architectural significance. This nomination was sponsored by the Columbus Landmarks Foundation as part of the Certified Local Government Program and with funds from the National Park Service through a Certified Local Government grant administered by the state office. There was much participation and promotion by neighborhood residents and the Teakwood Neighborhood Association. This nomination also, the new owners in the Teakwood were able to select any house plan or builder they wanted. These house plans came from magazines, builders, and some were designed by the owners themselves. These homes, the ranches, split levels of the make up the neighborhood reflect the prominent styles that were common throughout suburban neighborhoods in Columbus. And it really added to our understanding of mid-century residential suburban development and post-war residential construction practices and the sources of home design. This slide, of course, is just to illustrate the many uses of the National Register documentation beyond just the preparation of the nomination. It's information's used for walking tours and for other publications about aspects of Ohio history, and just other aspects to raise awareness. Neighborhoods post banners and other signage to call out their National Register designation. This has always been one of my favorite stories about the National Register as an education tool. This is Salem, Ohio, up in Columbiana County. The school children toured the National Register listed downtown Salem Historic District, learning about its history and architectural styles of the buildings. After the tour, the children back to their classroom and recreated the downtown using boxes and art supplies. This activity was just part of a year-long study of Salem's history and heritage that had been incorporated into her third grade curriculum. Communities throughout the state and nation faced the challenges of saving historic schools. The State Historic Preservation Office and Heritage Ohio worked with the Ohio School Facilities Commission in the early 2000s, along with national organizations, including the National Trust and Knowledge Works, to level the playing field of renovating versus replacing historic schools by negotiating some policy changes and providing technical guidance so school boards, districts, and citizens could make informed decisions. In addition to this, I also served on a working group for Columbus Landmarks to prepare a historical study of all Columbus public schools 50 years or older and making recommendations about their historic and architectural significance. This was at the request of the school district. Columbus Landmarks also formed a consortium of architects, engineers, planners, and construction companies to prepare this Historic Schools Technical Assistance Report that analyzed 4 historic schools to determine if they could be renovated to meet current educational standards at a competitive cost compared to new construction. The outcome was that the district decided to renovate a number of schools that had been previously slated for demolition. And one of the lessons learned from this is during the dedication of the rededication of the renovated East High School, you see there, then Columbus Superintendent Gene Harris, Dr. Gene Harris, said to several of us, "I thank the historic preservationists for saving me from myself." She admitted that she really didn't know what we were talking about or what what a renovated school would look like. She had a totally different picture in her mind and was obviously so pleased when she saw the actual result. But I think that is a lesson learned for people. We need to keep in mind, as familiar as all of us are in the preservation world about the positive outcomes, the benefits of historic preservation, it's not as familiar to others. Often these are the very leaders who are in positions to make critical decisions that affect properties. So there's never an end to the need for education and raising awareness. The other key to this local historic preservation success story was that Columbus Landmarks got involved with the school district to discuss historic schools very early in the school district's planning and thinking process. So it wasn't at a point where critical decisions had already been made. Not all schools are rehabbed as schools. Many were sold off by the local school districts and given new life and new uses with the assistance of the federal and state historic tax credits, which are such a powerful tool for rehabilitation in Ohio. And this is just one example, the open air school, significant early 20th century Columbus public school that was designed to provide an educational and healthful building and curriculum for the prevention of tuberculosis. It was designed by Columbus architect Howard Dwight Smith and it was completed in 1928. The rehabilitation project converted the school building into mixed-use commercial property with several restaurants, yoga, studio, and event spaces. And it's a wonderful, wonderful place to enjoy and see some of the character defining features that were associated with it as this open air school, such as this open patio and large rooms and big windows for cross ventilation. In the 21st century, threats were increasing to Ohio's historic courthouses as a result of deferred maintenance, the need for larger facilities, the demands of new technology, and often inaccurate perceptions that renovation would cost more than new construction. In 2012, the pressures facing historic courthouses culminated in the highly publicized, politically heated demolition of the Elijah Myers-designed Beaux-Arts Seneca County Courthouse. The demolition raised much awareness of the value of investing in the preservation of Ohio's historic courthouses. Heritage Ohio, Ohio History Connection, the State Historic Preservation Office, Ohio Supreme Court, and the County Commissioners Association of Ohio joined together to host the Ohio County Courthouse Symposium. The program included sessions covering the architectural significance of Ohio's courthouses, technical guidance for renovating and maintaining courthouses, highlighting successful courthouse renovations, and several inspirational presentations about the symbolism and local pride generated by historic courthouses. It raised much awareness and enthusiasm, and it was attended by county commissioners and other state and local officials, along with historic preservationists. And I think that's what is so important about building these partnerships. If everybody in the room is talking to one another about things we already know, and we're not bringing in, or the people who can make the decisions are not there sharing this information, we're often not as successful as we want to be. To wrap up here, talk about the National Register. I like to show off what the pieces and parts are that actually make up this nomination. Nomination includes the nomination form itself, that includes a thorough description of the physical appearance and characteristics of what's being nominated, the statement of significance that provides historic information and context to demonstrate how the property meets the National Register criteria and retains historic integrity. And then this narrative information is supported by current photos, historic images, and locational mapping. The entire National Register nomination package works together to tell and illustrate the story of the nominated property. And over the 50 more years that the Ohio Preservation Office has existed, it has amassed a tremendous amount of documentation, not only through the National Register, but through the survey programs as well. And these are useful tools to help be used to not only for all the purposes we've just talked about, but to help create those historic contexts and provide comparative analysis for new nominations. Again, essential elements for successful nominations. And I purposely picked the nomination for the Ohio History Center because it's, again, one of my proudest efforts at teamwork. The entire inventory and registration department last year prepared 2 years ago, prepared the National Register nomination for the Ohio History Connection, sort of as a birthday gift to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the building and opening of the property. So I want to close here with I want to give two shout outs. I want to give a shout out to the National Register staff at the State Historic Preservation Office, Mary Rohde, Abby Marshall, Carrie Simmons. I encourage you to seek out their expertise as you begin the National Register process. They're a great team. They know what they're doing. They can help you every step of the way. And also Marie Schwartz can address questions about Ohio Archaeological Inventory and Archaeology Survey. I think I saw he signed up, and I don't know if he's on the webinar or not, but I want to give a shout out to Fred Mitchell. Fred Mitchell really got me started in my career at the historic preservation. He and Steve Gordon were the regional office people in the Miami Purchase Association, Cincinnati Preservation, as it's now known, and Beth Johnson is its director. But I was a senior American Studies major at Miami University, and I did a volunteer internship with Fred and Steve and nominated a property to the National Register, the Hidley Cottage out in Butler County. And I did some survey work. But I also Fred just gave me so much insight and advice and sound good advice about a career in preservation, and really said, you got to go get a degree, a master's degree. And at that time, there weren't that many programs out there, but I found my niche. I found my place at the University of Virginia, where I received a master's degree in architectural history. And so just thank you. Thank you, Fred. So time flies. And I quote the Latin verse that is under the clock in the Ohio Supreme courtroom at the Thomas J. Moyer Ohio Judicial Center. While I am speaking, the hour is fleeting. But again, I want to say, lessons learned: never take yourself too seriously. The work, yes, but no person is an island. None of these examples were accomplished by me alone. I may have had the initial idea, but the project was carried out to completion through the efforts and work of many individual groups and organizations. There are so many motivations for survey work and nominating historic properties to the National Register. Those motivations and the role, the outcomes, what happened after the properties were listed, those are the stories that really need to be shared with community leaders, state and federal legislators. I'll say again, I've had the privilege to work with so many talented, enthusiastic individuals and groups. I tried to capture that by listing here the names associated with many of the surveys, nominations, and projects and initiatives I've talked about today. So thank you. Do we have time for some questions?
We do, Barb. We do.
What should I do here? Should I end my show?
Yep, you can.
And then close it?
Yep, you can just actually say stop share.
Oh, wait a second. Stop share. Okay, I did.
All right, we're back to big heads. All right, everyone. Thanks once again, Barb, for doing this today. If you have any questions, now is the time to start typing those in. I'm taking a short commercial break. If you're interested in learning about both preservation careers and the National Register of Historic Places, on Wednesday, October 15th at our conference in Canton, we'll have presentations on both of those. So if you haven't signed up already, please sign up now. You can go to heritageohioconference.com to learn more information about those sessions and get registered. All right, Barb, we got our first question here. Does having a building moved prevent it from being registered?
Not necessarily. The National Register has several, what are they call, exceptions to the criteria, and moved properties are one of those. That typically a moved property doesn't qualify for the National Register, but can under certain circumstances. And again, working with the State Historic Preservation Office, they can help walk you through those aspects and learn a little bit more about the property you're talking about, to determine whether or not it might meet that exception. Again, the National Register is place-based history. So the reason behind most of the exceptions to the National Register fall under categories where properties have somehow lost or don't no longer have that connection to its historic place. So that's why a moved property may not qualify. But like I said, there are exceptions to that. So maybe.
Wayne wants you to pick favorites, Barb. What communities in Ohio have done the best job of collectively promoting their properties and or sites on the National Register?
Well, man, any community that promotes their properties and lists them on the National Register and does survey, because it means they're taking seriously their history and their heritage, and they're trying to take it into the future. They're trying to celebrate that, but also make it work for them, and give their community that special sense of place that I think we are more and more and more going to gravitate towards in this world of sameness, this world of little faces in boxes like Hollywood Squares. I think people want the real deal. They want to go out and experience. They want to be surrounded by some place that has character. So, I pulled out, actually, some of those images I pulled out of the districts came from the numerous slideshows we did during the coffees that the State Historic Preservation on Heritage Ohio did for many years around Ohio to just promote the benefits of historic preservation. But I'm not sure I could single out one or two, but there are a lot of towns that have done a great job. And if you're a town that's just trying to get started, you can look to some of the Main Street programs of Heritage Ohio too. Those communities often go hand in hand with very active historic preservation programs. I don't know. I can't play favorites.
So another question here, Barb, is particularly, thinking back to your early days when you guys didn't necessarily have the, opportunities to meet with people as much and, get that prior knowledge about what was coming down the pike. What were some of those surprise nominations that made you kind of think about, oh yeah, that is, an important property to protect that were not normal in the sense of like a general historic building?
I'm going to say some, I'll think of great answers to this like this evening. So I want all your emails so I can email you back. I'd say some of those properties like that I talked about, like some, industrial buildings. You may, we see sometimes we see some buildings, and like I said, there's many different motivations for why people seek out to list properties in the National Register. And sometimes we, see some of these historic, industrial buildings. And let's face it, they are not on anyone's, number one list, maybe of top, aesthetically significant properties. And probably the motivation is that they have potential for economic development, which is all well and good. But again, they have to qualify for the National Register. So I think a lot of times it was really working with the people who were researching and preparing these nominations to really get at and learn the significance of some buildings that maybe were less obvious to the eye why they might qualify for the National Register, and then revealing and learning about this rich, history or this significant industry that took place there and were built, manufactured there, and how it contributed to Ohio's prosperity and growth. And if I can do a little aside, my sister and I are in the process of cleaning out our childhood home, ranch house in Bucyrus, Ohio, where my mother lived for 66, my mother and father, and all of us. My mother lived there the longest, 66 years. And we are amazed by how much we are finding. It is a 1958 ranch house, mid-century, and it's filled with a lot of mid-century stuff that still's there. My sister and I, we are amazed at how many things we are seeing that were manufactured in Ohio, made in Ohio, have these Ohio connections. It's really phenomenal when you start seeing how prominent Ohio was in this late 19th, early 20th, mid 20th century as far as manufacturing and stuff. So that's a long drug out answer to that. But I think it's the ones, where you kind of go into it like, I don't know, and then really dig deeper and learn a fascinating story, which I hope conveyed with some of those examples I showed too.
All right, Barb, we got one
Right,
final question
Johnson's
here.
Island, you're absolutely right, and certainly one that was a challenge to help all players involved understand the significance and understand the benefit to listing.
Barb, the last question here we have is any other areas of history that seem, oh, my question just moved on me here. Any other areas of history that seem to be underrepresented on the National Register?
Oh, absolutely. And, as time marches on, you're going to see, as history evolves, you're going to see more and more things associated with aspects of history that are not, completely fully documented in the National Register. And, I think one thing that comes to mind is there's probably always place for more actual archaeological sites, like historic archaeology sites, or we a number of years ago listed the first shipwreck site in Lake Erie in the National Register. So there's more opportunities for properties like that to be certainly to be documented and actually listed in the National Register versus just captured in survey records and survey reports. Expressions of architecture and property types, those types of properties like I talked about, the more vernacular property types, or residential neighborhoods that reflect a more broader pattern of approach to housing and development of housing that was just so widespread in the post-war era. We don't have a lot of those larger residential suburban developments listed in the National Register. And of course, there's always, aspects of culture and immigration and other cultural aspects that can be addressed. There's as long as there's history, there'll be something significant to nominate.
And I lied to you. We have a similar question from two different people, so I'm going to ask it before we go here. So this question is talking about significance and how significance is determined. So the first one I'll ask first is a simpler one to answer. What if there is no more house, but there are elements such as hitching posts and things like that from the original structure? Any significance to those?
Well, again, those three ingredients and historic integrity. And the idea about historic integrity is for the National Register of Historic Places program is that why is that property, that site significant? What is the story behind it? And then you have to know that significance before you can understand whether it has historic integrity, because knowing the significance of the site, the property, helps inform you what did it look like historically? What does it look like today? What are the essential physical features that have to be retained to help physically tell that story? Because there's all kinds of ways of telling history through written documentation, through historic markers, but the National Register is distinctive in that it links that story to a place, and that place has to have physical features and characteristics that help convey that. So, hypothetically, it would be more about whether the hitching post has a significance to it. And, if that's just one element of what had been a larger property with more built structures, I don't probably I would be skeptical about the success of that. But again, it's knowing that significance and understanding what's making this property significant. What is the story it has to tell?
Good answer. All right, Barb, I'm not seeing any other questions here, so thanks again for doing this. It was an absolutely wonderful webinar. Frank, do you have
Well,
any
thank you.
comments?
Do I have
Just
any comments? I think
Either of
I
you.
commented enough.
I just would like to also thank Barb for joining us, and I'm curious whether you're making a clean break from historic preservation in Ohio, or whether we might see you in the future in some other capacity.
Is there some chat in here that's saying something? Well, like I said, I love my job, and I felt like it was time to, see what next chapters are. And there is some next chapters, literally, that I'd like to write. And I mean, there are some research topics and some other things, I love my job, and I'm never going to, I think, never lose sight of my interest in Ohio history and Ohio architectural history. So I have some projects of that. And I feel like this is I'm very honored to say that I kind of feel like this is the culmination of my career, in that I have been appointed by Governor DeWine to serve on the Ohio Historic Site Preservation Advisory Board. So
Oh, all right.
Friday will be my first meeting. So there's spoiler alert to
That's
anybody.
exciting.
So I guess I start my 168th meeting of the Ohio. That's what we determined, how many meetings I had attended, but wearing a different hat in this capacity. But I'm happy to give back in that, contribute to historic preservation in Ohio and in that capacity now. But I have some other projects I'd like to work on and stuff. So
Good.
anyway.
It's great to hear that you're going to continue to be visible.
Well, as long as people are looking for me. So anyway, thank you again for inviting me.
You're very welcome. It's a treat to have you.
See you around Ohio.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Thanks again, Barb, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.